Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. I'm your host, Efrain Riveros, Dr. E.F. Rain. Today we will talk about exercise and alcohol. It's a combination that is relatively common in our society, and there are some insights that are important to discuss. So we have the honor of having an expert in that area. We have with us Dr. Jakob Vingren. He's the Department Chair of Kinesiology, Health Promotion and Recreation at the University of North Texas. Welcome, Dr. Vingren.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you so much. So we came across one of the papers of Dr. Vingren's team titled Alcohol After Resistance Exercise Does Not Affect Muscle Power Recovery, that was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research in 2018. And we are going to talk about this paper, but also about the extensive research that Dr. Vingren has been doing all these years. And actually, my first question has to do with that. Since when have you been working on this particular topic?
So I've been doing research on alcohol since about 2003.
So 2003, 20 years.
2003, yes. I started doing my graduate school. I took a break of doing my doctoral work, and then I came back to it once I started here as a faculty.
That's great. So this particular paper focusing on the effect of alcohol on performance after a bout of exercise. So what was the motivation to start this particular study?
So I'm really interested in how alcohol affects exercise performance, exercise recovery, and muscle physiology in general. So this particular study, which was one in a series of studies we've done, was looking at when you have people doing heavy resistance exercise, how does alcohol affect their recovery? And we've done a series of these, including looking at a variety of muscle damage and variety of alcohol doses and a variety of contexts. Because if you look at alcohol, there's really three in the context of exercise. You can drink before, during, or after exercise. And obviously, exercise is not just exercise. There's different types of exercise, generally speaking, breaking up into sort of aerobic type exercise and strengthening or resistance training. And as it turns out, the combination of those three scenarios of drinking and two types of exercise gives you different outcomes. So all exercise is not affected equally, and the timing differs depending on the mode of exercise as well, on what the outcomes are.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the consumption of alcohol before, during, and after, and it seems obvious that drinking alcohol right before doing exercise, you would think that is deleterious. But in this particular paper, you focused on the alcohol after you did exercise, which is actually very common in people who practice exercise on a regular basis. So what do you think is the effect on different stages, before, during, and after? Is it bad at all stages?
So usually when I talk on this topic, I usually sort of start out by saying that I come bearing good news, which is it is surprisingly difficult to find negative effects of alcohol. There are certainly some, and we do find them, but they're not quite as common as people might think. So if you look at exercise, yes, exercising during alcohol intoxication, if you're looking at cardiovascular endurance, it seems to be reduced, probably due to reduced glucose oxidation. But if you look at strength is not affected. So interestingly, there is a couple of different studies that have looked at strength while people are intoxicated, maximal strength, and it does not appear to be affected. And when you look at athletes, some elite strength athletes, especially Eastern Europeans, are notorious for drinking the night before events. So the day after drinking alone doesn't really seem to affect exercise performance. But what we're really sort of, those are less common. The most common, obviously, as you mentioned, is people go to the gym and then they go out or they have drinks. There's even now, at least in the US, some of the higher end clubs will, or gyms will have a bar at the gym so people can go and socialize afterwards and make it into a bigger experience. So that was sort of what the reason for this particular study was looking at, or when athletes go out and play a game and then they win or they lose, they celebrate afterwards by drinking, or they drown their sorrows by drinking, whichever way. But as you mentioned, the epidemiological evidence is quite clear that people that exercise more also drink more. So it's not that alcohol and exercise is not compatible. In fact, people that exercise also drink. So what we're looking at here in that particular study that you mentioned is we had people doing eccentric squats, which were quite heavy. And the idea behind that is that induces, with the amount that we had, some mild muscle damage that's isolated to the muscles involved. And we're really expecting to see a reduction in performance with the alcohol, because we have seen in some studies, and we've done some studies looking at the physiology of muscle signaling, that alcohol affects the recovery from resistance exercise. So, and some of the prior work done by Barnes in New Zealand show this as well. They did it with rugby players, looking at recovery being impaired when you drink alcohol after exercise. So we were looking to induce muscle damage, then give the people alcohol, and see how did that affect next day with jumping performance, especially sort of explosive movements. And surprisingly, we didn't find any difference. It might be that we didn't induce enough muscle damage. The subjects were mildly sore the next day, but they were not. They were resistance trained individuals, so it wasn't a novel exercise for them. So the damage that you see is less. But we still expected that alcohol would have reduced the performance, but it didn't in this case.
It didn't, and I found something interesting in the methodology, because there are other studies, as you mentioned, addressing a similar question, but you pay a lot of attention on the repeated bout effect. So you made the participants familiarize with the exercise, and that's kind of different to what other authors did. So what is the effect? What is that repeated bout effect?
Yeah, so we were already using folks that or individuals who were resistance trained, so they already have some of this repeated bout effect. So the repeated bout effect with muscle damage really comes down to that the first time you do an unaccustomed exercise, especially when it's eccentric exercise, which is when the muscle is lengthening under tension, induces quite a bit of muscle damage. Yet, when you do it repeated over time, that damage is diminished. There's a protective effect that can last up to 6 months from a single bout of heavy eccentric exercise. So since we used a repeated measures design where people came back one day with alcohol, another day without alcohol, or vice versa, we didn't want to skew the results such that the first day they were there, they would be more sore, regardless of what we did afterwards, alcohol or not, simply because it was the first time they did this exercise. So we made sure that they came in one time and everybody did the workout without any supplementation afterwards. So when they came in on their second and third visit, it wasn't as novel to them. So that could be part of the reason as well here, is that this was less novel. So there was already a protective effect, most likely, at that second and third bout from doing the first bout, which is sort of unrelated to the alcohol piece, but related to that repeated bout effect. And people know this sort of probably by other terms, but when they go and do a new exercise, often they're very sore afterwards. Next time you do it, you're not as sore afterwards. I mean, it's a little more complex than that, but that's sort of a very easy way to sort of explain this phenomenon sort of in something that everybody experiences, right? You go dig in the yard for the first time that year, you're really sore, but you go dig the next time and you're not quite as sore because you get that sort of protective effect from the repeated bout.
I see also that this is a crossover trial where the participants were exposed to both alcohol and placebo like sequentially, right? And you randomize to which one occurred first.
Yes.
Exactly. So can you tell us a little bit more about the protocol and how much alcohol you gave the group when they received the alcohol?
Yes. So you're correct. In sort of the method, it was a crossover randomized design. So half the subjects did alcohol first, the other half did placebo, and then they came back, and then we've switched the conditions, which is sort of a standard trial. We gave them about 1.09 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. So that is a blood alcohol of it's 0.01% or 1.0 per mil, depending on which measure you're using. In the US, you go by the percent. So it's in the US, the driving limit is 0.08. So this is above the legal limit for driving, that what we give them. And we give them the alcohol in 20 minutes. So across 10 minutes. They have 10 minutes to drink this. Every minute they take a mini shot, basically. So they get quite a bit of alcohol in a fairly short amount of time. And we use vodka.
Vodka. Okay. And then what did you measure in terms of performance to see if it was affected?
So we measured, leg soreness, which was largely just to see was there any difference sort of subjectively, and we didn't see any difference. We measured also high pole power. We've measured vertical jump, which are both sort of explosive measures of sort of power movements. We've had other studies where the similar protocol where we've looked at maximal strength and strength recovery. So when we look across a lot of these sort of targets, we see sort of the similar pattern. That there's no real, we didn't see any difference between the conditions, which I said was surprising. There's a couple of other things where we have found differences, but usually that's in the cardiovascular realm. When you look at the work by Barnes from New Zealand, they find drastic differences between the alcohol and the non-alcohol condition, but we have not been able to quite replicate those findings that they have.
Those same findings, yeah. I assume that you had a baseline measurement before the interventions, right? So that you could compare?
We do, but also more importantly, we compare the two conditions that really are identical, except that in one they have alcohol and one they don't have alcohol. So those will really be the ones that you would compare, because and we blinded the subjects as the best we can to the conditions. So we would smear alcohol on the glass, and there'd be alcohol in the room, so you smell it. But if you're used to drinking, especially with high doses, there is the obvious effects that you can feel: the flushing, the warmth of alcohol that you cannot mask. Generally speaking, when people got the alcohol, they could tell that they had gotten alcohol. When they got the non-alcohol condition, it was about 50-50 whether they thought they had alcohol or had no alcohol. So it masks it fairly well in alcohol, but you cannot, completely blind people to the alcohol condition, because just that physiological feeling of, you can't blind to that,
Yeah, and your study supports the notion that maybe acutely, that at least that dose of alcohol doesn't really affect significantly performance, at least with the measures that you used. But alcohol, and probably that goes beyond the paper, and I am basically asking you as an expert. So what are the molecular effects of alcohol on the muscle that may potentially affect performance if you use it chronically?
Yeah, so of course we're looking at a fairly small group. We have to have big differences in order for us to see it, right? That's usually sort of in research studies. If you're an elite athlete, 1 or 2% is a huge difference that you may not want to risk. And most of the differences we've seen has been around some more. So alcohol does appear to affect recovery. We just haven't seen it. We haven't seen as much. Other people have seen it more from resistance exercise, whereas alcohol seems to affect the performance in aerobic exercise. If you want to look at the molecular pieces, we've done quite a bit of work on that as well, looking at we've taken muscle biopsies, for instance, and looked at what happens. And what we see is that the mTOR signaling pathway seems to be affected. Now, interestingly, there seems to be a gender difference here, where men seem to be more affected and women seem to be protected for some reason from this. And I'm not quite sure what that is, other than if you look at, I said mTOR signaling, it's blunted in men with alcohol, but not in women. And that also leads to some of the differences that we've found, because we've done some studies in women where we saw no effect at all on strength. But when Barnes and colleagues in New Zealand did the same study, or we replicated their study in women that they had done in men, they saw reductions in strength in men. When we did it in women, we didn't see these reductions. So it seems that there is a difference in how men and women respond to physiologically to alcohol, which is quite interesting to me. And in particular in this mTOR signaling pathway. See.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. Probably for our audience, it's important to recognize the role of mTOR in protein synthesis to actually cause the muscle hypertrophy. So I think I'm not an expert, and probably you can explain it better. What is the importance of mTOR and that pathway to be affected more in men than in women?
So can you see my slide here?
Yes.
Yeah. So if I back up a little bit, I'll show you where mTOR sort of fits in. But these are the results. But if you look at just here we go. Here's sort of a very brief version of protein synthesis. Obviously, much of a simplification. And if you look over here on the left, you can see that muscle contraction signals through both mTOR. So we have through nucleus, which is signaled by hormones such as steroids like testosterone and such. But you also have muscle contraction signaled directly to lead to increased protein synthesis through the mTOR signaling pathway. And that's the one we looked at. So mTOR is heavily involved in increasing protein synthesis by increasing sort of elongation. And it's also the pathway it's affected by nutrients. Leucine, for instance, upregulates this pathway. So it's really one of the two very important aspects of increasing protein synthesis. You can either have increased gene transcription, or you can have increased translation of that mRNA that's transcribed. And that's where mTOR comes in actually increasing the rate at which you're producing protein, and thus obviously sort of lead to hypertrophy. And if you look at just effect of alcohol alone, it has effect on testosterone that differs between men and women. It has, we've done some work looking at androgen receptor, where it seems it has some effects, though we haven't published that yet. It certainly reduces protein synthesis. So this is just alcohol by itself. And if you look at the protein synthesis, mTOR signaling pathway here, you can see how alcohol comes in. It increases AMPK, which ultimately leads to a reduction in mTOR. That ultimately leads to, through all these different pathways, to less protein synthesis. The interesting thing about this pathway is that it's also affected by exercise, but in the exact opposite direction. So when you have resistance exercise, it increases mTOR, which then leads to an increase in protein synthesis. So that's one of the reasons we were really interested in that mTOR pathway, because you have resistance exercise, you have alcohol. Well, what happens when both of those come in, because they have opposite effect on this pathway? So that was really sort of the question we had, and we've done a series of studies looking at this with different exercise, a couple of different exercise interventions and a couple of different outcome measures, and we looked at it in men, we looked at it in women, and that's sort of what we're really interested in when you have these in together. And there's a couple of studies. So Parr et al. Have done one where they looked at mTOR, they looked at P6 or P6 kinase 1, which is further downstream, and they also show that alcohol seems to reduce mTOR phosphorylation, so mTOR activation. Now, they did a lot of leg extensions and cycling, and ultimately also leads to a reduction in protein synthesis. So with alcohol, it seems that it's not protein degradation that's affected, it's protein synthesis that's reduced, which is where mTOR sort of signaling fits in. And then we did a series of studies, including one here with men and women, and you can see in the men, with the placebo, you see an increase in the signaling, and with the alcohol, that increase is not there. Yeah. But we didn't see that in women. Women pretty much responded the same way with and without alcohol in both of these two measures of that mTOR signaling pathway. So it seems that protein synthesis is involved. And that fits in, at least with some of our studies, that men's recovery seemed to be affected more than women's recovery from heavy sort of resistance exercise. And this is 6 sets of 10 squats at 80% of 1 RM. That's pretty hard. Most people cannot finish this workout without us lowering the weight. So this is certainly a very intense workout. It doesn't necessarily induce a lot of muscle damage, but it certainly induces a lot of muscle activation. And we previously used it to look at androgen receptor and such. So we get a very robust muscle signaling with this type of workout.
Yeah.
And this was again with that same sort of level of alcohol, which is quite a lot. I mean, for some people, this is equivalent drinking 5 to 8 drinks, small drinks, granted, but in 10 minutes. So it's quite a bit of alcohol that we're giving people. Obviously, about 1.5 times the legal limit for driving. So pretty similar to what might happen to people out in the real world.
Yeah, I see that. And going back to the differences between men and women, so do you think that there is like a hormonal difference that goes beyond the molecular level that is affected at the receptor level better?
Yeah, since you ask, I actually have some data on that. I'll see if it's in here. This was sort of an early study we did. This was just with men, and we saw differences in testosterone in men. So men, generally speaking, with resistance exercise, you see an increase in testosterone, and then it comes back down to baseline or below baseline. What we found was that during late recovery, so 60 to 300 minutes after exercise, with alcohol, you saw like another rise in testosterone, which was really surprising and caught us off guard. We were expecting a suppression of testosterone. But what we think is happening is that testosterone is not being taken up by the androgen receptors. And that's why it's going up, and that actually this rise in testosterone is a bad thing. I remember when we published this paper, we read, some of their websites went, oh, alcohol is the new recovery drink. Like, no, that's not what we're trying to say, because we don't actually think this is a positive. As much as I would love for that to be true, I don't think it is. I think it's because the body is reacting to this and not taking up. So we got interested in looking at this, and we looked at the androgen receptors here. We haven't published this, we just presented it. And this is looking at androgen receptor response. And the red line is what we normally would expect. You see an increase at 3 hours, and then it comes back down at 5 hours. And if you look at the men, you can see that there's a drop in that receptor at 3 hours and a further drop at 5 hours, which mirrors just in the opposite direction, if you will, or inverse of what we saw with the testosterone concentrations. So the idea that testosterone is not being taken up is at least potentially there. The next step, of course, is to have labeled testosterone and see where does it go. But if the muscles have less androgen receptor, and it doesn't matter how much testosterone you have floating around, if you don't have any receptors, there's no molecular action.
Yeah.
But if you look at the women, you don't quite see that. They both go up at 3 hours, and then and sort of stay level with alcohol, or keep going up even for placebo in women. So you see again a different response to the alcohol in men and women. So as you mentioned with hormonal response, yeah, I think there is a difference. Of course, men have about 10 times the testosterone of women, generally speaking, and it's much more affected. It comes from different tissue. And it seems to be affected more by alcohol in men. So both what we saw, but also if you look at it at rest and just give people a large bolus of alcohol, women's testosterone either don't change or sometimes even increase, whereas men's testosterone tend to decrease with large bolus of alcohol. And certainly with chronic alcohol abuse, you see drops in testosterone in men. So yeah, I think there is a gender dimorphism here in the response that probably, or certainly in my view, includes the hormonal response and dimorphism in the hormonal response, or differences in the hormonal response that triggers into some of these other molecular actions that we're looking at, including why women may be more protected against alcohol damage following exercise than men are.
I see. It's pretty interesting. And so in terms of recommendations, so probably we shouldn't recommend women to drink after exercise, I guess. But in terms of the use of alcohol, based on all the research that you have been doing, what do you think is a sound recommendation? Should they be allowed to have a certain amount of alcohol after a bout of exercise? And how to avoid that to become chronic so that the performance is going to be affected more? Because I assume that everything that you are showing ends up being cumulative, right?
Yeah, so that's the thing we haven't done, which is really hard to do in humans, obviously, is have someone be drunk for 3 months and see what happens. The ethics board will not let us. We've done some work in rats where we've seen effects on different muscle fiber types, and it seems that type 2 fibers are more affected, especially, again, looking at the androgen receptor. So ultimately, you're right. Exercise adaptation is really the accumulative effect of exercise bouts over time, right? So if you have a small reduction in your every time, that adds up. So if you are exercising and you are training for the Olympics, okay, I don't know if alcohol is going to have a negative effect, but maybe don't risk it. If you are a normal person, like me, I am not training for the Olympics currently. So I would say you can have alcohol. Alcohol is not as detrimental as people think it is. My general recommendations is moderate what your intake is. It seems quite clear that with lower amounts of alcohol, the few differences we do find are reduced, right? And with low amounts that we find really no effects at all. So you got to get up to fairly high blood concentrations before you see the negative effects. Also, separate your drinking as far from your exercise as possible. So and depending on the type of drinking and the type of exercise you do, my recommendations are going to be a little bit different. If you know, let's say Friday night, you're going to go out and you are going to have a good time, okay? You're going to go out drinking a lot, then maybe don't go to the weight room right before that and have a heavy workout. Maybe you do a cardio workout instead, or maybe you do a lighter workout where there's less muscle damage for you to recover from. Or maybe you don't go to the gym at all, which is really weird for me. I'm an exercise researcher, right? So it'd say don't work out, but you may be worse off the next day than if you hadn't worked out at all because your recovery is negatively affected. And we rarely go to the gym to be worse off, right? But the best advice, obviously, is to not overindulge in alcohol. And if you are, separate the time from your workout and the type of workout you do from alcohol drinking. The next day, there's nothing that should prevent you. If you have a hangover and you can work out, you should be fine to work out, but your cardiovascular endurance may be reduced. So the night before a big race is maybe not the time to go out drinking, but if you want to go for a run the day after, and you can do it, you probably just won't go as fast as you would if you hadn't been drinking. So I don't think you have to avoid it. Avoiding, abstinence rarely works. But moderate how much you have, 1 or 2 drinks instead of 5 or 6, maybe.
Yeah, moderation is definitely the key.
Yeah.
And also probably taking into consideration effects of alcohol on other organ systems, right? Because I assume if you have other medical conditions, you have to be even more cautious. And that's also true. Sometimes people do exercise, but they are not completely healthy otherwise. So it's something to definitely consider. And I think that's a good way to wrap up our conversation with all these recommendations. And I think it's very interesting because I went over several papers of your group, and I think probably you guys have the biggest amount of research in the topic, and that's actually a privilege having had you talking to us today. And with those clear messages and sharing the slides and everything, it was really a privilege for us. Thank you so much, Dr. Vingren.
Thank you for being here. It's been a privilege for me too.
Thank you. So for our audience, you will find the links to the papers that we discussed today and some information about Dr. Vingren and his lab and his team. And don't forget to leave us feedback and if you have any questions. Thank you for being with us today. See you in the next episode.